Talmudists.
Okay, the topic of my talk is, was Resh Lakish a hedonist or an ascetic? How the Bavli conveys meaning. So there's a Yerushalmi in a couple of places that talks about wine that was left uncovered, and it says, when someone would ask Rabbi Yonatan about drinking wine left uncovered, he would say to him, "Am I a guarantor for your life?" Meaning, you'll probably die. Rav Shimon, the son of Lakish, said, if you sold yourself to gladiators, you sold yourself for much money. With this, drinking wine uncovered, you sold yourself for little money. And in here we find the seed of the Resh Lakish being a gladiator, which is the topic of the passage we'll look at today. Resh Lakish dies 2 times in the Babylonian Talmud. Before that, Resh Lakish had several incarnations. He had successful careers as a rabbi, a robber, and a gladiator. He appears to be the type who excelled at anything and everything. The Tosafos, like most Bavli readers, are confounded by the problem presented by the 2 death narratives in trying to construct a coherent biography of one of the Bavli's primary heroes. In one of the stories, Resh Lakish is portrayed as a robber who becomes a rabbi only to be forsaken by his greatest friend and intellectual rival. Where did Resh Lakish go after Rabbi Yochanan insulted him? Did he return to life in the robbery trade? Did he become a gladiator? A possibility hinted to in the epigraph above, as well as the second death narrative. Yes. Did he become a gladiator? A possibility hinted in the epigraph above, as well as the death narrative at 47a that we will look at later. In that story, Resh Lakish sells himself as a gladiator and eventually dies. Did time lapse between the gladiatorial contest and his death? Did he become a robber and rabbi during that time lapse? The Tosafos conclude that Resh Lakish was first a rabbi, then he became a robber and a gladiator, and then a rabbi again. In the following analysis of the Bavli Sugya attached to Mishnah Gittin 4.9, I wish to explore 3 modes of Bavli authorship. By author, I refer to the entity that introduces those literary mechanisms into the text that work to control the text's meaning-making mechanisms. In some instances, these systems appear to have been placed in the text intentionally, and in others not. Furthermore, in some instances, they appear to be the product of large-scale intentional activity undertaken by a specific group of people during one short historical interval. In other instances, they are the product of incremental changes to the language of the text over a long period of time. The first authorship mode I explore is the effect of ambiguity, and how ambiguity is not only a tool an author can use to express ambivalence, but more importantly, a mechanism which serves to invite the reader to partner in the meaning-making process. I believe that engagement with ambiguity is a central feature of the Bavli reading experience, and that therefore the authorship of such ambiguity must be explored independent of other forms of authorship found in the Bavli. Second, I will explore the work of the Stam, both an anonymous voice in the text and a group of people who manipulated earlier sources. This activity promotes both a new agenda and reflects changing social and ideological issues. While the Stam is a sugya-centric concept, the third author function I explore, the Superstam, works at the level of the Bavli as a book. The work of the Superstam operates on top of the work of the Stam and has no voice at all. It is rather an effect. So let's look at the first source. Since I don't have the source sheet, I don't know what. And I have some extras here. Okay, so we're looking at a short story in Gittin 47a, and it is found, for those of you following in English, it is part 3 on the second page. Okay. Resh Lakish sold himself to gladiators. He took a bag and a stone with him. He said, It is known that on the last day before the gladiatorial contest, anything the captive asks of the gladiators do for the captive, in order that the captive's blood be sweet. On the last day, the gladiator said to Resh Lakish, "What is good for you?" Meaning, what is your last request? That was a custom they had. Resh Lakish said to the gladiator, "I want to tie you all up, sit you all down, and hit each of you with a bag and a half." When Resh Lakish struck him once with the bag, the captive's soul departed. He gnashed his teeth, and Resh Lakish said to him, "Are you laughing at me? I still have a half a bag remaining." Resh Lakish killed them all, and he comes out. Next part of the story, part 2. Resh Lakish was sitting, eating and drinking. His daughter said to him, "Do you want something upon which to recline?" Resh Lakish said to her, "My daughter, my stomach is my pillow." Part 3. When Resh Lakish died, he left Kava de Morika, and we're going to go into detail what that means. He quoted a biblical verse about himself, and they leave their wealth to others. The message of this odd biographical tale of the 3rd century, second generation Palestinian Amora is not immediately clear. When trying to understand the story, it is quite natural to look at how the story ends in order to understand its meaning or moral. However, this story concludes with an ambiguous phrase. What does Kava de Morika represent, and how does the appearance of the phrase in this story alter the meaning of what precedes it? The Gittin 47a narrative unfolds in 3 parts. The first part tells of Resh Lakish's voluntary captivity and escape. The second part details the conversation he had with his daughter. And the third part provides information about how much money he had or did not have at the point of his death. And then it is followed by a verse, a model that Resh Lakish had about wealth acquisition while he was alive. It's quite possible that the story's narrator is recounting historical facts. Resh Lakish, the person, rather than a literary character, sold himself to gladiators, brought a bag and a stone with him. He subsequently kills all the gladiators, using a ruse that does not so much highlight Resh Lakish's keen intellect as much as his captive's inwardness, because captives would voluntarily allow themselves to be tied up and killed are a really unlikely story. If this story were indeed an accurate portrayal of real occurrences, one would have to ask how the narrator would be privy to such information. Perhaps the narrator was a co-captive of Resh Lakish and witnessed events. This co-captive then escaped together with Resh Lakish and lived to tell the story. Others passed down the story orally, and we have it today. Or perhaps the story was told by one of the people in the Colosseum who saw this happening, and perhaps that's the original frame of the story.
Could have been told by Resh Lakish himself.
Okay. We'll get to that. The second part of the story, Resh Lakish's interaction with his daughter, can also be retelling of actual events. In this case, there certainly could have been an eyewitness to the events recounted. Someone saw Resh Lakish lying on the floor having a conversation with his daughter and recorded it. The third part of the story likewise can also be the retelling of actual events. Resh Lakish, in fact, had Kava de Morika in his possession at the time of his death. He also might have been fond of saying this verse and leaves others as well during his life. However, this third part of the story, though perhaps historically accurate, reveals the hand of an author and indicates to the reader that this narrative is not the mere recounting of historical facts. Someone has juxtaposed the precise quantity of Resh Lakish's property at the point of his death with the biblical verse he recited while alive. Additionally, someone merged the death scene with the gladiator and daughter stories to effect. Once we've established an author, we can ask the question, of all the possible objects used to convey the meaning of the story, why choose Kava de Morika? The problem presented to the reader trying to understand Resh Lakish's philosophy at the point of at least the second and third parts of the narrative about wealth acquisition is that Resh Lakish's wealth is described by the words Kava de Morika. A kav is a measure meaning 2.5 liters. It's also a generic term for measure, and much like the English term meter is a measure by what means measure and a measure by which other measures are measured. Therefore, kav either means 2.5 liters, or a basic or small amount. 2.5 liters might not seem like a large amount of volume, but if that volume is gold, or in this case, if Maurika is saffron, the most expensive spice, which has often been compared to gold, then indeed it is a large sum of money. To compound matters is the history of words to describe flora like saffron in the ancient world. The word saffron comes to Indo-European languages from the Arabic usufer. Usufer, like Maurika, is a word attached to color, and like Maurika means something like make yellow, and describes something used to dye clothing yellow. Saffron eventually makes its way back to Arabic and becomes a new word, zafran. The Arabic word usufer is also a source for the word used to describe an altogether different dyeing substance, safflower. Safflower is a cheaper alternative to saffron used in dyeing clothing and is often known as bastard saffron. The two plants or flowers look nothing like each other, but share a similar function, making yellow, and that's where they get their names from. Maurika in rabbinic sources could either mean saffron or safflower, and we have examples where it clearly means either or. I mean, clearly means one or the other. So the word is inherently ambiguous. So therefore, kava and Maurika is double ambiguity. We don't know if kava is large or small, and we don't know if Maurika is expensive or cheap. The doubly ambiguous phrase kava and Maurika therefore denotes either a large or small amount of wealth and generates two possible readings of the second part of the story, Resh Lakish's philosophy about what to do with your money. In turn, each reading will also shed different light on the meaning of the first and second parts of the story. If we read kava de Maurika as 2.5 liters of saffron, worth a large sum of money, then the second and third parts of the story read as follows. So we're going to read the story now two ways, working backwards from did he leave a lot of money or little money. So the first one is he left a lot of money. If he left a lot of money, Resh Lakish is sitting on the floor and having Resh Lakish is sitting on the floor and having a meal when his daughter offers him a seat. He declined the offer because he was an ascetic. He was one who didn't indulge in worldly pleasures. Sitting on the floor was good enough for him. As a result of his asceticism and thriftiness, he left his daughter a nice inheritance. According to this reading, Resh Lakish either uses the partial verse, and he leaves others as well, literally, because he's leaving others as well, or the beginning of the verse is the part that's left off is fool, and the fool leaves others his wealth, and then Resh Lakish is pointing out the contrast between his philosophy of asceticism and his and the psalmist. This is a verse in Tehillim that is he's critiquing himself with. Okay. However, if we read kava de Maurika as just a small amount of safflower, then the second and third parts of the story read in the opposite way. If Resh Lakish leaves nothing at the point of his death, then he is strictly following the advice of the psalmist. Only a fool would leave something at the point of death, and his philosophy was to spend money. Resh Lakish did not want to be a fool, and he spent every bit of money he had during his lifetime. According to this reading, Resh Lakish is seen eating and drinking. The narrator is not describing an interaction between Resh Lakish and his daughter while he is eating a meal. Rather, the words sitting, eating, and drinking describe a hedonistic way of life. Now, if we look throughout the Bavli, these terms that are put together, we have three different meanings. One meaning is taking a meal, which fits in with the first way we're reading it. One meaning is rejuvenation from a sickness, which could very well be, if you use the Hedonist sort of thing. And then the third way is depleting possessions. When a guardian depletes possessions of orphans, this term is used. So here we would use it as he's sitting, eating, and drinking, having a feast, and depleting his possessions, leaving nothing else. Resh Lakish indulged in gluttony, so much so that when his daughter saw him sitting on the floor and offered him a pillow, he pointed out that he had become so incredibly fat that he had no need for a pillow. And for those of you that know the other Resh Lakish story, is embedded in the story about fat rabbis, and this speaks to that. By the other Resh Lakish story, I mean the one where he becomes converted and dies. To put it shortly, his enormous stomach acted as a pillow. Accordingly, accordingly, depending on how one interprets so now we have two different readings, and we don't know whether Resh Lakish is a hedonist or an ascetic, and that's the way the story ends. So when we're looking for the moral of the story, we're left with the moral of the story is either two opposites. Accordingly, depending on how one interprets the ambiguous phrase Kavod and Morika, this story has Resh Lakish championing two different lifestyles as well as two different attitudes towards saving and spending. The fact that the first part of the story paints a picture of Resh Lakish that is quite in contrast to the one that we would expect of rabbinic attitudes towards asceticism, gluttony, spending, wealth accumulation, wouldn't bother us in this instance because it was painted with a picture of a rabbi that is kind of very different than what we would expect of a rabbi, so we're open to the message. So to sum up, if we read Kavod and Morika as a large amount, 2.5 liters of saffron, then Resh Lakish is an ascetic, and his purpose for selling himself as a gladiator is noble. He is a rabbinic warrior hero. He's not selling himself for the money. He's a rabbinic warrior hero who sells himself only has an opportunity to kill his enemies. Those goyim, non-Jews, who we'll see in the Mishnah that this is talking about, referring to those goyim that we'll see in the Mishnah. If, however, we read Kavod and Morika as a small amount of safflower, no money, then Resh Lakish is a hedonist who sells himself into dangerous situations to support his lifestyle. But why end the story with the ambiguous Kavod and Morika? Although it is not clear if ambiguity was the intention of the person who placed those words in the story, it is likely that Morika was always ambiguous and has a long history of semantic drift, and this is true of words of that type in the ancient world. The effect of this ambiguity, though, whether the result of an author or semantic drift, is that the story expresses an ambivalence about a problem at the heart of the human experience. What approach should we take to life? Should we enjoy life, or should we not enjoy life? Additionally, the ambiguity both leaves room for the reader and engages the reader in the meaning-making process. It therefore works to continue the process of Bavli, which is thwarting resolution, long after the Bavli's text is fixed. So the Bavli invites the reader to participate in the process, and that is what Bavli is. Okay, the fourth chapter of the Mishnah again details a bunch of enactments called Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam in the Mishnah is nothing to do with Tikkun Olam as it is spoken about in today's society, but rather it means enactments that are geared to fixing social problems that the halakha up until that point did not address. So the last one that we're dealing with, and this is prusbo, lending with interest, and other measures. The last Mishnah says if someone sells himself and his sons to goyim, to non-Jews, we do not redeem him. Community doesn't redeem him. However, we do redeem the son after the death of the father because of Tikkun Olam. The Yerushalmi further defines the case of the Mishnah. Okay, in 3 steps. The Yerushalmi says, anonymously, the case of the
Source number 2.
Source number 2. The case of the Mishnah is one where he sold himself and repeated selling himself a second time. However, if he only sold himself once, then we do redeem him. Part 2. And if we sold himself to gladiators, Ludin, even if only once, then we do not redeem him. Part 3. There is a story about a certain person who sold himself to gladiators. The situation was presented to Rabbi Abahu. Rabbi Abahu said, "What shall I do?" He did it for his livelihood. So Rabbi Abahu redeemed him, going against the phase 2, which is that we don't redeem people who sell themselves to gladiators, even if it was the first time. In treating the Mishnah, the Yerushalmi makes a number of moves. First, Section A, it eases the enactment of the Mishnah so as only to apply to selling yourself twice rather than selling himself once. Second, it removes children from the equation, whereas in the Mishnah we are talking about someone who simultaneously sells himself and his sons. Here it's just someone who sells themselves. Although the Yerushalmi might not alter the intent of the Mishnah by omitting the children from the discussion, it makes no use of the Mishnah's mention of children in explicating the Mishnah. As we will later see, the Bavli will make use of the contrast between the laws of redeeming the father and the laws of redeeming the sons, when defining or redefining the parameters of the Mishnah. Third, in Section B, the Yerushalmi qualifies its adjustment to the enactment of the Mishnah and declares that if a man sells himself to gladiators, then he is not redeemed, and this is so even if it was only the first infraction. As we will see, the Bavli attributes to a named authority, Rav Asi, a similar statement to the anonymous one we found here regarding repeat offenders. However, the Bavli statement attributed to Rav Asi is slightly different than the anonymous one in Yerushalmi. Now let's read the Gemara in the Bavli. Source number 3, part 1.
This appears before the story you read.
Yeah, it appears before. Okay, so this is what comes right after the Mishnah. So that was the Yerushalmi's interpretation. Now we have the Babli's dealing with the same Mishnah. Rav Asi said, the Mishnah speaks of the case where he sold himself again and again. Shana B'Shilish. Certain members of Beinifsi, a town, who borrowed money from non-Jews and did not have any money with which to pay them back, they came, the people who lent the money came and captured the guy who borrowed the money, and they came before Rav Huna. Rav Huna said to them, the person who was captured, the people that were captured. The pronouns in the Bavli are very ambiguous, and in my translation I kept them ambiguous and being true to the text, but when I'll tell you now who's talking. So Rav Huna said to the people who sold them, who were kidnapped, what can I do for you? I cannot redeem you because the Mishnah says if one sells himself and his sons to non-Jews, we don't redeem them. So Rabbi Abba objected to Rav Huna, said, but you, Rabbi, have taught us that the Mishnah speaks of a case where he sold himself again and again. Rav Huna said to Rabbi Abba, these members of Beit Mifsi regularly do this. They regularly sell themselves, and the community redeems them who are having no more. Here we have an attributed version of the anonymous statement of the Yerushalmi, that the Mishnah refers to a case where the subject sold himself more than once. In the Bavli, it is Rav Asi who excludes first-time offenders from the rule of the Mishnah, but there is a slight difference between Rav Asi's Bavli statement and the anonymous statement of the Yerushalmi. So whereas the anonymous statement of the Yerushalmi said when someone sells himself and repeats it, here we have, that's just the second time, here we have a third time. And the third time is Shana V'Shilish, could be translated as again and again, and that could either mean regularly or it could mean three times. Okay, so it's unclear whether or not this legal narrative serves to interpret Rav Asi, and that Rav Asi actually meant 3 times specifically. It is also unclear whether it was Rav Asi who originally was the anonymous voice of the Yerushalmi, and he just meant twice. But the Stam, the editor of this sugya in the Bavli, changed the statement of Rav Asi to be 2 and 3 times in conjunction with the story that uses the word regularly. Additionally, the legal narrative here takes liberties with the case of the Mishnah and introduces the concept of being captured for failure to pay a debt. According to the Rav Huna story, if one is captured for failure to pay a debt, then he is equated to one who sells himself. By equating the two, the Bavli has introduced the concept of coercion not present in the Yerushalmi. In the Yerushalmi, you just had to sell yourself, which has ramifications for understanding the intention of the Tikkun Olam principle in this case. For since this man was taken captive and did not sell himself, then it would be more likely that it is communal burden rather than deterrence, which motivates enactment, unless the deterrence is don't sell yourself, don't borrow money with interest because you'll end up selling yourself. And this appears a number of times in the Bavli, that idea. In any event, by redefining a repeat offender as only someone who does so regularly, the Bavli further eases the restriction against redeeming someone who has sold himself as a slave. So, to review, the Mishnah states that we do not redeem such a man on a first offense. The Yerushalmi states that we do not redeem such a man on a second offense. The Bavli applies this restriction only to the third offense. Yet at the same time, the Bavli introduces legal narratives to the opposite effect of Rabbi Abba's legal narrative in the Yerushalmi. So whereas in the Yerushalmi we had you're not allowed to sell yourself to, we don't redeem you if you sell yourself to gladiators, and then the story says that Rabbi Abba did. Here we have a story where they okay. So In the Bavli, in even more lenient law is presented where you're allowed to sell yourself 3 times, yet it is followed by a story that ignores the leniency of the law. Rav Huna does not redeem the man even though he didn't even sell himself. Gittin 46b continues with the second legal narrative, part 2, I guess, which continues this trend, namely that the Bavli is more lenient than the Yerushalmi when presenting normative rules, yet more stringent than the Yerushalmi when recounting stories about the applications of the normative rules. In the following case, the Bavli does not even issue a normative rule regarding gladiators. So whereas in Yerushalmi we had, you don't get redeemed if you sell yourself to gladiators, here there's no law about gladiators in the Bavli. Selling yourself to gladiators is the same as selling yourself to a non-Jew. Yet the legal narrative presented regarding such a sale takes a drastically more stringent stance than the one found in Yerushalmi. Okay, so a certain man sold himself to gladiators. He came before Rabbi Ami and said to him, "Redeem me." Rabbi Ami said to him, "The Mishnah states if someone sells both himself and his sons to non-Jews, we do not redeem them. However, we do redeem the sons after the father, and this is because of kilkula, damaging result," and we'll discuss what that is. And it should certainly be so that we should redeem the father in this case because his death is involved. So Rabbi Ami's argument is that if in the Mishnah we're willing to redeem someone just because of kilkula, here it's pikuach nefesh, someone's going to die, we definitely should. But the rabbis didn't like this. The rabbi said to Rabbi Ami, "This man is an apostate, either a mummer or meshullim," because they saw the man eating food, dead animals, food that had died without being ritually slaughtered. Rabbi Ami said to the rabbis, perhaps he was eating it for enjoyment rather than spite. The rabbi said to Rabbi Ami, but there were times that there were both permitted and forbidden meats in front of him. He left the permitted meat and ate the forbidden one. Rabbi Ami said to the man, "Go, they're not letting me redeem you." This section of the Sugi introduces 2 elements found in our Mishnah that were not dealt with in the Yerushalmi. In a way, the crafter of this story is returning to the Mishnah and explicating and expounding upon it. These 2 elements left behind from the Yerushalmi are the notion of Tikkun Olam and the involvement of the sons in the story. None of our normative statements or legal narratives have dealt with the sale of sons, and this story is no different. So whereas the Mishnah only talks about a case where a person sells himself simultaneously with sons, none of the stories of Yerushalmi Bavli have anything to do with the Mishnah in that sense. However, both the concepts of Tikkun Olam and sons play a role in Rabbi Ami's argument. Rabbi Ami here reads the words Tikkun Olam as emphasizing the second half of the Mishnah. The Tikkun Olam is not that we do not redeem the father, as was implied by the Yerushalmi and the other Bavli story, but that we do redeem the sons, and that's what the Tikkun Olam is. The enactment is made for the sake of the sons, and it is ordered that they do not lose their Jewish identity. As Rashi reads this passage, the reason the Mishnah only requires redemption of the sons after their father's death must be that while their father is alive and in captivity together with them, he will protect them against corruption. Of course, the actual reason why the Mishnah's ruling might be about after the father dies, because maybe they don't want the father to continue to sell the sons over and over, but that's not the way Rabbi Ami read it. Rabbi Ami argues that we are willing to redeem the sons merely to protect against the possibility of their corruption, then we certainly would be willing to redeem the father who is facing certain death. Even though the Bavli seems to be more lenient than Yerushalmi when speaking normatively, when making laws, and even though the gladiator exception is not mentioned as a law normatively in the Bavli, we nonetheless have a legal narrative that runs counter to the sentiment projected by comparison of the normative elements of the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, leniency. In this story, Rabbi Ami does everything he can to redeem the man, but he is not allowed to do so by unnamed rabbis. These rabbis don't buttress their arguments with the Yerushalmi's, with an appeal to the Yerushalmi's gladiator exception. In fact, the gladiator element in the story is waved away by these victorious anonymous rabbis. Where Rabbi Abahu of the Yerushalmi ignored the gladiator factor simply because the man in the story wanted to support himself, these rabbis will not even be swayed by the man's potential death. The author of this sugya purposely ignores the gladiator exception of the Yerushalmi. The purposefulness of this action can be detected from the fact that gladiator concept still appears in the sugya. The sugya knows of gladiators. Therefore, the Sugya makes a strong statement about a shift in social concerns between Babylonia and Palestinian communities. In Babylonia, it is now the spiteful apostate who has taken the place of the seller to gladiators as one who is not to be redeemed. And with that shift, Tikkun Olam is no longer seen as a deterrent nor a protection of communal property, but rather as a safeguard for the Jewish identity of children of spiteful apostates. How should we view authorship of this story? This story is written almost entirely in Aramaic. There are no attributed statements in the classic sense. And the one Hebrew part is a quote from the Mishnah. There is also no anonymous voice in this story. There's no stop. Yet it appears that unless the whole thing stops. We'll talk about that afterwards. Yet it appears that the Bavli here presents a story that entirely reworks the one found in Yerushalmi to a different aim. When viewing the Bavli and Yerushalmi sugyot side by side, it appears that A of the Yerushalmi, repeating, generates part 1 of our Bavli sugya, talking about repeating 3 times. And part B and C of the Yerushalmi, the gladiator and the Rabbi Abahu legal narrative that he freed the guy because he was afraid that he was going to die, generates part 2 of our sugya, which uses those elements. If we can discover such activity in the Bavli on the basis of the Yerushalmi, rather than any linguistic clues culled from the Bavli itself, then how should we approach the authorship of the Bavli when confronting passages in which we have no parallel sources? Okay. The third and final section of the Gemara on this Mishnah is the Resh Lakish story we treated earlier. When read in isolation, the story uses ambiguity to express ambivalence about wealth accumulation and spending. The ambiguity also works to invite the reader into the process of writing meaning into the story. When taken in context, the Resh Lakish story seems to further abrogate the bias against self-sale to gladiators found in the Yerushalmi. However, when the Resh Lakish tale is read in the larger context of the Bavli, an authorial mode external to the subject serves to reinforce the attitude toward apostates implicit in the Rav Asi legal narrative. So whereas the words kav, whether 2.5 liters or a measure, and morika, whether safflower or saffron or safflower, are both ambiguous, in the Bavli, the phrase kavod de morika has a direct reference which addresses and resolves the double ambiguity. So this is on the handouts. You can look at it later if you like, but I'll just, for time, I will just summarize Gittin 14a. The only things you have to know is that Rav Acha Bargala is involved in this story, and that kavod de morika is defined as a small gift. Rav Acha Bargala only appears in the Bavli 3 times. The word morika only appears in the Bavli 8 times. It's no accident that one of the other sugyot in which Rav Acha Bargala appears deals with morika, and incidentally, in that case, it must be saffron. This is to be expected. It is a symptom of the way the Bavli was constructed. It's a book constantly crafted and recrafted through the manipulation of related materials. Though changing ideas are the primary motivation for such work, oftentimes it is language that is both the material for such work and its catalyst. If we use the term stam to denote the authorial function which makes concrete and unilateral changes to pre-existing sugyot, then the superstam is the effect elicited by the sum total of both all conscious stamitic moves as well as accidental and minute linguistic transformations to the text. Therefore, while the stam works to control the meaning conveyance modes of the sugya, sometimes by supplying an anonymous voice, the superstam serves the function of controlling the meaning conveyance of the Bavli as a whole. This is so because of the peculiar literary structure of the Bavli and the expectation it seemingly has of its implied reader, most important of which are the Bavli's self-referentiality, nonlinearity, and laconic mode of expression. In this instance of kavod de morika, the relationship between Gittin 14a and 47a, it is difficult to tell which force is at work. Was kavod de morika introduced at 47a to point to 14a, or was it introduced to 14a to point to 47a? We don't know the order. No matter what the chronological history might have been, in this case there are still 2 types of authorial modes at play in the reader's experience of the text. The Bavli's implied reader reads while focusing on the local text reading. But this reader also has constant peripheral awareness of the global text to which the local text points.
Therefore, for the reader, local readings always stand in contrast and tension to global readings. Through Gittin 14a, the superstam, whether intentionally or not, acts from outside of the local context to control the ambiguity found at the end of the Resh Lakish story. So Gittin 14a controls the meaning of Gittin 47a from the outside. It therefore works to control the meaning of the sugya in its entirety. Kavod Marika at Gittin 14a is defined as a small amount. Gittin 14a therefore defines the Resh Lakish of Gittin 47a as a hedonist. He left a small amounts. He was sitting, eating, and drinking. He sold himself as a gladiator to get money to support his lifestyle. Had Kavod Marika been defined as a large amount, the point of the Resh Lakish story would have been type of hero fantasy. Big bad rabbi defeats his enemy with physical mastery and a bit of God. However, the effect of the superstam here is to convey the following meaning. Resh Lakish sells himself in order to support his lifestyle, and this type of sale is still valorized. The Resh Lakish story therefore emphasizes an implied point found in part 2, the Rabbi Ami story. There is nothing wrong with voluntary sale to gladiators for profit. In fact, in the instance of Resh Lakish, it is even valorized. But there is one more important function that such a reading of Resh Lakish story serves for the 46-47 sugya as a whole. Resh Lakish, as hedonist and glutton, is a momer l'te'avon. He is an apostate, an appetitive apostate. This detail works to reiterate a feature of the previous Rabbi Ami story, namely that an appetitive apostate is still a communal concern. So it drives home that point. We transferred, although it's a story about a gladiator, the story about the gladiator is transferred. The meaning is transferred by Gittin 14a to now make it about, oh, remember, we don't care about gladiators anymore. We care about appetitive apostates. While the Rabbi Ami story, when viewed in isolation, shifted the focus of Tikkun, so if we didn't have 14a, shifted the focus of Tikkun Olam enactment away from the seller and onto the sons, the Resh Lakish story reasserts the focus on the seller by re-engaging the issue of movement.
We have time for questions now. If anyone has anything to ask, Steve. Anyone?